rather than go down the rabbit hole of trying to, find exactly what the perfect percentage is, I think the important thing is that you should intend to do most of your training at low intensity, and you should follow through on that intention. The training you intend to do at low intensity should actually be executed at low intensity. And most endurance athletes aren't doing that.
That Triathlon Show 152. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Matt Fitzgerald, who is a very famous coach, author, endurance athlete, and nutritionist. And our topic today is 80-20 training, which means doing 80% of your training duration at an easy intensity and only 20% at a moderate or high intensity. And Matt, along with David Warden, co-wrote the book 80-20 Triathlon, which has just been released a few weeks ago. And we had, obviously, David come on the show before in episode 121 to talk about this, so you can go back to that and listen to it as well. But today with Matt, we dig a bit deeper into the topic and get quite practical, to be honest. With David, we talked a lot about the research behind it. But today with Matt, we focus more on the application side of things and what athletes should and should not do when it comes to doing the right training intensity distributions in their training and following 80-20. Although, as we'll get into, there's no magic in round numbers. A lot of you have been sending in questions about this topic as well, and I do hope that and think that we managed to cover all of those. I specify some listener questions that I got through Facebook. If you aren't already a fan of Scientific Triathlon on Facebook, go and like that page, because that's where I sometimes post before I do interviews and give you the opportunity to chime in with listener questions for my guests as well. But some of the other questions that I ask also are generated by listeners that have come in ever since my interview with David, really, so over a long time. So before we dive into that interview, this episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration. And as you know, they make electrolytes to help you replace the sodium that you lose in your sweat, which is very individual because some people sweat a lot, some people sweat less, some people have more sodium in their sweat, and some have less. There are 3 different ways to sweat test, including the whole body washdown technique, which you basically exercise naked. And then there's patch testing, which is also an in-exercise test method. And then there's the at-rest non-exercise sweat testing protocol, which Precision Hydration uses and to great success. They have sweat test centers in 18 countries, so you can find one near you, hopefully, on their website if you're interested in getting an exact specific number of how much you sweat and how much sodium your sweat contains. But if you don't want to get that specific, if you prefer quick and easy and free, then there's the free online sweat test, which is a 4th bonus way. And you can take Precision Hydration's free sweat test on their website. I'll link to it in the episode description as well. That will give you a personalized hydration strategy for training and for racing. And if you want to order any of Precision Hydration's electrolytes to then follow that plan, then you can do so with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com, and that will give you your first box for free. This episode is also sponsored by Stack, that make the world's quietest indoor bike trainers. They have a new smart trainer version out on the market. It's the Stack Zero Halcyon, and this trainer recently won the award for the best bike training accessory, beating a lot of other trainers and other accessories at Eurobike 2018, probably the biggest industry event in the cycling industry. So that was a fantastic achievement the jury evaluated the Stack Zero Halcyon as outstanding in its degree of innovation, in its design, and in its added value to cyclists. And they stated that we are greatly impressed by this new, absolutely low noise solution for a home trainer. The use of suspended magnets also means there is no direct contact between wheel and rollers, which in turn eliminates added wear on the bike. If you want to check out the new Smart Trainer Stack Zero Halcyon or their previous versions, which are still great trainers in their own right, the Stack Zero Base and the Stack Zero Power Meter models, go to stackzero.com. That's STAC and zero spelled out.com. And if you want to get 20% off when you order the trainer, and why wouldn't you, then use the promo code TTS20 to get that 20% discount. All right, so let's get right into the interview with Matt Fitzgerald. Today's guest on That Triathlon Show is Matt Fitzgerald. Matt, how are you doing tonight or today?
I'm doing very well tonight for you, today for me. I'm in California. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you, and we have plenty to discuss, so let's just dive right in. And 80/20 Triathlon is your new book. We talked about it a little bit before the interview. It's been out for roughly 4 weeks in the States, and we obviously had David Warden, your co-author, on before, but if you can sum up the take-home message to start with of the book, what is it about?
Yeah, so if I were going to put it on a t-shirt, the message would be slow down to get faster. The most common and costly mistake that not just triathletes, but all endurance athletes make in their training is spending too much time at a moderate intensity versus a low or a high intensity. And the 80/20 in the title of the book refers to the idea that the most effective way to balance intensity in endurance training is 80% of your total time at low intensity and 20% at moderate to high intensity. Most endurance athletes spend almost half of their total training time at moderate intensity, which is way too much.
And can you define the intensities? Like, how can you define what is low intensity, moderate, and high intensity? And also talk a little bit about where this comes from. How do we know that 80/20 is a good model and distribution to follow?
Right. So yes, there are various ways of defining intensity, but for 80/20 purposes, the threshold that really matters is known as the ventilatory threshold, sometimes called the first ventilatory threshold. And that is an intensity at which your breathing rate during exercise spikes. So if you're just a little bit below that threshold and you increase your intensity, initially, of course, the more intensely you exercise, the harder you breathe. But it's sort of a linear increase at first. But when you get to this threshold, there's a big bump. It's not something that you necessarily would be conscious of, but if your breathing rate is measured, it's mathematically significant where that jump occurs. But it's not a very high intensity. For the typical trained endurance athlete, it's somewhere around 77-78% of maximum heart rate. So that's the borderline between low and moderate intensity. And the reason it seems to matter so much is that when you cross over that threshold, going from below it to above it, your brain begins to recruit a lot more fast twitch muscle fibers. And that makes the exercise significantly more stressful to the nervous system, which means it takes a lot longer to recover from. So, if you're just below it, the exercise is just a lot less stressful to your nervous system, and you need less time to recover from it than if you're just above it. That's why that threshold is very important. As for where it comes from, the original research behind 80/20 was done by a gentleman named Stephen Seiler. He's an American exercise physiologist based in Norway. And about in the early 2000s, he did some research to try to figure out how elite endurance athletes actually distribute their training intensity. and across different disciplines, running, cycling, swimming, triathlon, rowing, Nordic skiing, he found that elite performers in all these sports tend to follow this 80-20 balance. There's some fine print to that, but that's the pattern he saw over and over again. And subsequent research on recreational endurance athletes has shown that that distribution is also more effective for increasing fitness than other ways of balancing intensity.
So that brings me to some follow-up questions. First, regarding the recreational athletes, this is something that I also asked David about. But is there a threshold for when you're training so few hours that actually 80-20 is not effective anymore? Or can we go deeper into that, basically? Because I get a lot of questions from athletes asking if 80-20 still applies if they train X amount of hours and they're not sure that it's necessarily right from them.
Right. So, that threshold probably has to exist somewhere, but it's quite low because one of the studies that was done with recreational endurance athletes found that, and it was runners, Spanish runners, found that when these were athletes who ran on average about 45 minutes a day, which is not a lot, or pretty typical for a recreational athlete, and they benefited more from an 80-20 intensity balance than they did from a program where they spent a lot more time at moderate intensity, as most runners do. So that's a pretty low volume where 80-20 was still more beneficial. And honestly, if you get much lower than that, my question to you is like, what's the point? What do you really want to train for a marathon on 30 minutes a day?
Yeah. Well, that said, for some like beginner triathletes that train for a sprint distance, it's a relevant question. But yeah. I want to go a bit deeper on this topic because I'm very curious as a coach myself as well. After interviewing David, I really started tracking and my intensity distributions that I gave my athletes. And in some cases, it followed an 80-20 distribution. In some cases, not. I couldn't really see a correlation between how well the athletes progressed, to be honest. Some that had less easy training, and most of that harder training came on the bike and swim, not on the run. The run almost always followed at least 80% easy, if not more. But in total, if we calculate for all three sports, I see in a lot of athletes that I coach with just my intuition-based programming, I don't always fall in the 80-20, but I saw that they still progressed really, really well. So, and some of the weekly durations for those athletes were like 7 to 9 hours per week, perhaps, that sort of range. So I started to think, could it be that it's different in triathlon, in multisport, when you have 3 different disciplines? Or what's your take on that?
Well, the first thing I would say is, there's no magic in round numbers. It's 80-20, give or take, or roughly approximately 80-20. So I think it's more, rather than go down the rabbit hole of trying to find exactly what the perfect percentage is. I think the important thing is that you should intend to do most of your training at low intensity, and you should follow through on that intention. The training you intend to do at low intensity should actually be executed at low intensity, and most endurance athletes aren't doing that. Right. If that is a giant mistake that nearly every non-elite endurance athlete is making, is that they don't have enough easy training in their program, and or the training they think that they're doing at low intensity is actually being done mainly at moderate intensity. So when you fix that problem, just having the right plan and then executing it, then you can start to worry about the minutia of the numbers, but that's really not the main point. So there's plenty of wiggle room, and I'm when I even though just sort of as an exercise, proof of concept in the book, we calculate with the training programs that are in there, you see the numbers, and, they do hew very close to 80-20. But in my day-to-day work as a coach, I'm not sitting down with a calculator. It's, if I went back, and sometimes I do, and just calculate the training I've given, it's always, relative. It's in the ballpark of 80-20, but I don't worry about exactitude at all. I worry, I focus more on, experience and intuition. I really do it the same way you do.
Yeah, no, I can 100% buy into that, what you said, that the easy training, there should be a large amount of easy training in the program, and it should be executed as easy and easy enough, right, and not moderate. That makes total sense, definitely. And since we're talking about calculating these distributions, if an athlete wants to do it for themselves, let's say they are self-coached and they make their own program, how do you actually go about calculating how much training you do in the easy, moderate, and high intensity zones?
Yeah. So, first, obviously you have, even if you're just planning, you don't really need to know what the specific numbers are, because there are different metrics that you can measure intensity with. You can do power, pace, heart rate, and even perceived effort. So regardless, for the actual planning, almost all of the high intensity work is going to necessarily occur in interval formats, where it's not one extended block of high intensity swimming, cycling, or running. It's an interval set when you're either passively or actively recovering between relatively short high intensity efforts. And for calculation purposes, and this comes straight from Steven Seiler, he says that the entire interval block should be counted as time at high intensity, because that really reflects the true physiological stressfulness of interval training. So, low intensity workouts are generally, just basic bread and butter aerobic sessions, but also warm-ups and cool downs. Those count as low intensity. Recoveries between intervals do not. They count as part of the high intensity intervals. And then moderate intensity is usually done in, medium-sized blocks, longer intervals or tempo or threshold efforts. So, it's not except for that little wrinkle with the intervals, it's pretty easy to calculate. If you're going to do, it needs to be time-based, not distance-based. So that's also important. So if you typically measure, say, your runs in kilometers, and you're planning, a 20K long run, you'll want to, for planning purposes, know about how long that will take at low intensity, so you can, do your calculations on a time basis, which makes swimming a little bit complex. But in the book, we sort of explain how to handle that.
Yeah. And that should answer most of the questions that I get about how to calculate it, because I do get a lot. Dean, listener of the podcast, here's the answer for you. One of the most common ones would be that time between intervals, what to do with that. You answered that already. It counts as high intensity. Warm-ups and cool-downs are low intensity. So within a high-intensity session, an interval session, you can have both low-intensity durations and high-intensity durations, or you will have that, and then you just add up on a weekly or monthly or whatever it is basis and just calculate the percentages. And if we go to measuring, you mentioned power, heart rate, RPE. Can you tell us a little bit about what is is it useful to do that, like in hindsight, analyze what you did? And if so, which metrics do you recommend using?
Yeah, it's very useful because, you mentioned in your work with athletes, you look for patterns. Does an athlete improve more or less, with a given breakdown of intensity? And then, at a group level, what patterns do you see? But as an individual athlete, you want to know what's working for you, or It's not that different if you're trying to lose weight. It's easier to lose weight in a methodical way if you actually weigh yourself instead of just looking in the mirror. So I mean, it starts with planning, just having the intention to train this way. But then, a lot of the tools that exist, the online tools and such for logging or journaling your training allow you to see time in zones. And it's useful to track, A, to make sure you're actually doing what you intend to do, but B, to look for just, individual patterns in terms of the results you're getting. Because there's subtler questions such as within that 20% bucket, which encompasses moderate and high intensity training, what's the best balance for you, moderate versus high, if you're training for, say, a sprint triathlon versus an Ironman distance triathlon. So there are still questions that you need to answer through heuristics, trial and error, and monitoring your own personal training intensity breakdown as you go can be very helpful in fine-tuning your training approach.
Yeah, exactly. And even one tip that I would give, what I do when I look at an athlete's workout, I use Training Peaks, but you can do it in other platforms as well. There is a range if you use Training Peaks Workout Builder, like I have a power range or heart rate range that the athlete is supposed to hit. And I just overlay what they actually did with that planned range. And I can see if they fell into that range or not. And then it's very easy to visualize if they held a targeted intensity or they actually overdid an easy workout, for example. Then I will see that the heart rate curve or the power curve is above that target range. And that's something that I assume that many platforms can do. And by the way, can you talk about your calculators that you have on 8020endurance.com, because they can help with setting training zones and etc. So it can be a useful resource for athletes to learn about right now.
Yes, so there are obviously different intensity schemes out there. We have our own for 80-20. It's not that different from others, but everything hinges on initial testing. Because obviously, the zones are not the same for everyone, and they actually change for you over time as you gain or lose fitness. So in the book, we describe, and also on our 80-20 Endurance website, some calibration tests, lactate threshold tests that you can do to establish, your current fitness level, and then you put the result into our online calculator, and you get your zones. You can also do it in running through a recent race result. So if you've run a 10K race, you can put your time in and get running zones that way.
Yeah, perfect. So it's 8020endurance.com, and I'll link to that in the show notes. So it's easy to find. What's the time frame that 80-20 should be followed at? Is it like every week should be roughly 80-20, although, as we said already, it's not, the magic is not in round numbers, but you get what I mean. Do you need to look at it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, or what's the time frame here?
I think weekly makes sense. Daily, or because there are people who are beginners who might think, okay, so every workout needs to be 80%, 20%. No, that's a bit like weighing yourself too often if you're trying to lose weight, or checking the value of your stock portfolio too often. You can drive yourself crazy by becoming too granular. So backing out and analyzing on a weekly basis. That doesn't mean that there aren't times when you want to be above doing more or less than 80% of your training at low intensity over the span of a week. We can get into that, but during those times when you are trying to follow the 80-20 rule, it should balance out on a weekly basis if you are training in 7-day cycles, which most of us are. Because if you are training in 7-day cycles and your balance is off in 1 week, then it's probably off in every week because you're following essentially the same schedule from week to week. So that level of analysis does make sense.
Yeah. And what about the distribution across disciplines for triathletes? Should it be roughly 80-20 within each discipline, or can you do less intensity in, for example, running and take some of that intensity and put it to swimming or cycling? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So in my previous book, 80-20 running, which is for runners, obviously same concept. A lot of runners, they tend to get injured. So they may do some swimming or cycling, not because they compete as triathletes, but so that they can build more fitness than they can gain on a safe amount of running. And for those athletes, I tell them, if you're competing in running and not in whatever form of cross training you're doing, the overall balance of your combined training should be 80-20. But it doesn't matter really if your cross training includes high intensity, more than 20%, less than 20%. It doesn't matter as long as sort of when everything is mixed together, it's 80-20, because the human body, physiologically, it doesn't really know whether you're swimming, cycling, or running per se. But if you are a triathlete, it's a little different because you're actually competing in every discipline you're training in. So your performance capacity for a runner, cycling is just supplement. It's just cross training. But for a triathlete, you are swimming on the clock in a race, you are cycling on the clock, and you are running on the clock. And therefore, if you get the most performance gain from the 80-20 approach, you should be 80-20 in all three, or you just won't improve as much. So that's the way you need to look at it. And there was an interesting case study done with an elite triathlete that I describe in the book, where this is an Olympic level triathlete, and she was also Spanish, and her training was tracked over an entire year. And when everything was combined, swimming, cycling, and running, the intensity balance was very close to 80-20. If you looked at swimming, cycling, and running separately, they were all three very, very close to 80-20. So that's how you do it.
Very interesting. One thing that we also talked about already a bit is Steven Seiler's research and the concept of polarized training, which is not quite the same as 80-20, as you alluded to a little bit. But can you explain that a bit further? Because that's the other thing that I get a lot of questions about. Yeah.
So I mentioned that the most common mistake that endurance athletes in making their training is getting caught in what I call the moderate intensity rut, where they're spending too much time at moderate intensity. That doesn't necessarily mean that training at moderate intensity is bad. It just means that most people do too much of it. However, there are some people out there who think that you should avoid moderate intensity altogether, or really minimize time spent at moderate intensity. And that leads to the polarized training concept, where all of your training is either low intensity or high intensity, and little to none is spent at moderate intensity. That's polarized training. You would still want to get the most out of a polarized approach. You would still want to spend a lot more time at low intensity than you do at high. So you could think of polarized training as sort of a radical version of 80-20.
Yeah, I had an interesting discussion yesterday actually with the head coach of the Norwegian triathlon team, and I don't know how closely you follow the ITU circuit, but Norway has made big strides recently, and they swept the men's podium in the ITU race, in the World Triathlon Series race in Bermuda, which no nation has ever done before on the men's side. US has done it a few times on the women's side. But this is a small country with less than 5 million inhabitants and not a climate that's conducive for triathlon.
Right.
So it was a great discussion. And I asked him specifically because Steven Seiler's research is conducted in Norway, and they follow definitely something that looks like an 80-20 approach with a lot of volume and a lot of low intensity training, but they don't follow a polarized training model with a lot of high intensity. In fact, they avoid high intensity and do mostly low and moderate intensity and try to stay at or below their lactate threshold. And he said his reasoning he has been discussing with Steven Seiler is that still, even though that research comes from several different endurance sports, the bulk of it comes from, for example, cross-country skiing, where actually the majority of race distances are quite short, quite a lot shorter than Olympic distance triathlon. So I thought that was an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist myself, so as a coach, I take a pragmatic approach. I can't wait for the scientists to figure everything out because I have athletes training for races today. Excuse me. And what makes sense to me today is that exactly what you suggested is that within that 20% bucket, which encompasses both moderate and high intensity, how you distribute your time there should really be dependent on the distances you compete at. So if you're a pool swimmer, doing 50, 100, 200, 400 meter races that just take minutes at most to complete, I think most of the 20% should be spent at high intensity. You're still doing 80-20, but you are doing something more polarized. Whereas if you're an Ironman competitor, most of the 20% should be at moderate versus high intensity. And if you think about it, because I'm training for an Ironman right now, when you're training upwards of 20 hours per week, you can't do 20% of that high intensity.
It would be very tough.
Yes. So yeah, that's my approach. I hope there's more research done in this area to fill in the picture. But just as a coach, I think I have it figured out decently already.
Yeah. And to add to that, just looking through your book, 80-20 Triathlon, that we'll also link to, of course, in the show notes. In your training plans for the Ironman, for example, you seem to have more of that high intensity training earlier in the training build up for the Ironman, and then the closer you get to the race, the more you move into more and more moderate intensity, which is more race specific, I guess. Yeah,
that's a great point. We've been speaking up to this point as if a training block was monolithic, and you're whatever you're doing in week 4, you're also doing in week 12. Of course, that's not the case. So it can evolve. It can and should evolve. A principle I generally like to follow is that your training becomes more and more race specific as time goes by. So in the early part of a training cycle, you can afford to work on aspects of your fitness that are important but aren't as specific to racing as you want to do later in the cycle, closer to competition.
Yeah. And one more question that I have is what has happened in the field of research on 80-20 training and polarized training since David was on? Because we really went quite deep into what we knew from a science perspective at that point, and we don't need to dive deep right now. We talked about some other more practical things, and we'll talk a little bit about your book after that. But are there any new and exciting things and studies that have come out since David was on the podcast in a half a year or so ago?
Yeah, it's funny you ask. After my 80-20 running book came out, I stumbled upon a video of a presentation that Steven Seiler had given. The video was just on YouTube. He was speaking at a conference, and he in the slideshow he showed my book. He showed the cover of the book, and he joked that now that his research had been turned into a book, he needed to find something else to work on. But he's actually gone and done exactly that. So more recently, he and others have turned their attention to exactly what we were just talking about, which is periodization. So conducting studies where everyone is pretty much training the same, except in terms of how they sequence different types of training. So Everyone's training the same amount, everyone's doing the same intensity distribution, but if there are, say, two phases, an A phase and a B phase, some athletes will do the A phase and then the B phase, and others will do exactly the opposite, B versus A. So what they're trying to drill down into and shed light on is, does it matter? Or, what is, we already know some of the parameters of effective training, the space you need to operate in, but this is a sort of a more granular question, just what is the best way to sequence phases of training to get the best results. So, research is sort of moving in that direction lately.
Yep, very interesting. We'll follow, watch this phase. So about the book then, what can you tell us about the book that we haven't covered already? Any additional things that the listeners will get out of it when they read it? Yeah,
I think it's worth underscoring that there's an entire the book contains complete training plans. So they're obviously organized by degree of difficulty and also competitive race distance. But there's also an entire chapter that shows you step by step how to create your own training plan. Now, a lot of athletes would not be comfortable doing that, but I think it's a really valuable chapter to read anyway, even if you do intend to follow one of the plans in the book or a plan you find online, because just understanding the logic of training plan design will help you sort of buy into what you're doing more, and also make smart decisions when you experience difficulties, when problems arise in your training. So I'm sort of proud of that chapter where we just break the whole process, exactly what we do for athletes. When we create a training plan for them that's customized, we show athletes how to do that for themselves.
Okay, brilliant. And I can also underscore your strength and conditioning section that you have in there, which I think is another very useful thing to include, even though that's not the main point or the main message of the book, but it just underscores how important that is. And that's also another thing that a lot of athletes really undervalue and don't execute as they should, even though I guess many athletes now are aware that they should be doing it, but they don't. So having that in there, I think it again raises and increases the awareness of that.
Yeah, so a couple of interviewers have pointed out that it's actually the longest chapter in the book. But I like to point out it's only because there's lots of photographs.
Yeah, and it's all pretty girls doing that. No, I'm kidding.
Right. Yes. It's funny, when I was younger, I used to model for some of my my own photo shoots for a book, just to save money. And I am an athlete, so I look like an athlete. But I'm 47 years old now, so when I had this photo shoot done, I picked much younger people to do the model.
So I have a couple interesting listener questions that I got sent on Facebook in preparation for this interview. And the first one is from Dan, who asks, do sweet spot sessions on the bike, over-unders or crisscross interval variations, for that matter, fall into the gray area, and shouldn't they be avoided? I guess we already answered that, because we're not saying that moderate intensity is bad. We're just saying that athletes tend to do too much of it. But then the second part is, I can't see how an 80-20 approach can work with very time-restricted training. And we sort of touched upon that already, and I do I do to some extent agree as well. Again, going back to when I made my intuitive plans and then calculated the distributions, and it was more like 70-30 or something like that in many cases. In some cases, even 65-35, if I'm completely honest. But is there anything that because I think this is an important topic that comes up time and time again, anything else that we need to talk about in regards to this 80-20 approach working with time-restricted athletes?
Yeah, again, I would go back to what I said before, which is that just make sure that you intend to do forget the numbers, that you intend to do most of your training at low intensity, and that training is actually done at low intensity. Because the biggest mistake people make is not doing 70-30 instead of 80-20, it's doing 45-55. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and if you break it down into low, moderate, and high, it's more like 45-55, 0. Zero high intensity. Because most people, if they're doing their quote unquote easy stuff at moderate intensity day after day, they don't have the energy to do actual proper high intensity training. So I know people get fixated on numbers, and shoot, we put numbers in the title of the book, but it's kind of important to not lose the forest for the trees and understand exactly what you're trying to accomplish. If 65-35 works for you, that's still a heck of a lot closer to 80-20 than what most people are doing.
I'm sure the publisher preferred the title 80-20 Triathlon over Do the Easy Training Easy Triathlon or something like that.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, that really does answer the question. And you can plan for 90-10 or whatever, but if you go too hard in those 90% of the sessions and nothing is really truly easy, then you're missing the point. So great, that's answered. And then the final listener question is from Tim. It would be good to know if there is any guidance on how to pick power targets within the zones. Say, for example, I'm writing a workout and it calls for a zone 3 interval. Should I pick a low, middle, or upper end target of the zone? Or should we be working within ranges? And if so, how to define the range?
Yes, that's a great question. So my approach typically is to you tailor your specific effort to the specific format of the workout. So let's take zone 5, which is the highest zone in our system. You could do 20-second intervals in zone 5, or you could do 90-second intervals in zone 5, or anything in between. You would not, it wouldn't be my intention for you as a coach to do the 20-second intervals at exactly the same power as the 90-second intervals, unless I had a specific reason for it. And it also, the shorter the intervals are within the same zone, generally the harder you should, or the higher you should aim within the zone. And also the total number of intervals is going to affect how you're basically, what you're doing is pacing. And I think this is where the gadgets, the usefulness of the gadgets, that's their limit. And eventually, you're a living, conscious, feeling human athlete. Like you have some responsibility to use your capacity to think and feel to pace workouts appropriately. So, you should sort of just understand how hard you're supposed to go. Let's say, you're going to go to the track and run, 10 times 400 meters in zone 5. The idea is to finish that session having done every interval at about roughly equal splits for every interval, to not start too fast and be, bombing, slowing down a lot in the 9th and 10th intervals. And you want to finish the workout feeling tired, but not completely wrung out as if you'd done a race. So maybe you could do 1 or at most 2 more at the same pace, if you absolutely had to. And, I don't care how perfectly your zones have been prescribed. You're going to blow that workout the first time you do it if you're a novice athlete. If you just happen to be fit, but you're also inexperienced. So it takes experience. You have to learn how to pace workouts, and so the structure and the zones, they don't do the whole job for you. They set you up for success, but then execution requires actually pacing with reliance on perception of effort to a certain degree.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, like the zones are set on one day in a certain set of conditions with a certain nutritional and hydrational status. They're a moving target. Like there's a lot of day-to-day variation in that. So you need to learn to pace them, and a range is a good thing to have, absolutely. But then using pacing to determine within that range how hard to go in that workout.
Exactly.
So let's wrap up with some rapid fire questions. So take just 15 seconds or less to answer. these ones. And the first question is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon or endurance sports?
Book, blog. Oh no, I can't name any of my own books.
No, I'll name them in the post-interview chat.
Book, blog, or resource. Trying to think of what I go to. I'm going to give you one out of left field. For running, I really love Greg McMillan's online calculator. So it's at mcmillanrunning.com. I'm on that website constantly. It's very useful for digging down deeper to set pace targets for all different kinds of workouts. And also, performance equivalence calculations. If I can run a 5K split in X time, what might I be able to do for 10K? So I love Greg McMillan's running calculator.
Yeah, I love it too. I'm on there all the time. McMillanrunning.com. Okay, next question. What do you wish you had known or done differently at some point in your career?
A long list of things, but I've only got 15 seconds. So, I guess number one would be my first few books I wish I hadn't written. So to be honest, I wish I'd taken more time to know what I was talking about before I started talking. It's frank but true. And any author who's going to be honest will tell you that there's stuff they've written that they'd rather have back. I'm proud of 80-20 triathlon and the stuff I've done more recently, but sometimes when you're young, you tend to think you're an expert before you're an expert. And I guess, maybe there's no other way. I just had to learn the hard way, but it is something I learned.
And finally, who's somebody in endurance sports that you look up to and admire?
I'm a big, what they call jock sniffer. So I'm a fanboy of top athletes. I love, elite. I'm a fan of the sport. So I'm a big fan of Lionel Sanders right now. He has a great story. He's a gritty guy. He's really deserves the success that he's having. So Lionel Sanders is my answer to that one.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll keep talking, but the listeners will have to wait one more week. But next week, we'll actually have a second interview with you on your book and the overall topic of the endurance diet. But in the meantime, where can listeners find out more about you and the book and everything that you got going on?
Yeah, so we've already mentioned the 80-20 Endurance website, and then my personal website is mattfitzgerald.org. And
we'll link to that in the show notes and the Amazon link for the book and everything else that we can think of, social media. Thank you so much, Matt. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed that interview. And my main takeaway here really is that there's nothing magic in the numbers, but what you should do is you should plan to do a lot of your training at an easy intensity, a large majority of your training at an easy intensity, and then follow through on that. Don't just put it in your training calendar that this will be an easy run, but then go out and run at a moderate intensity. Then you're not getting any of the benefits. It doesn't matter how you plan. You need to have that follow through, and you need to be diligent and practice intensity discipline in that matter, or intensity control. In a couple of episodes, speaking of intensity control, you'll hear an interview with Arild Tveiten, who is the head coach of the Norwegian triathlon team. And if you follow the short course triathlon circuit, the WTS World Triathlon Series racing scene, you'll know that Norway, which is a tiny country population-wise, with less than 5 million inhabitants, I think, and with a climate that's not exactly conducive for triathlon training, they were the first nation ever to sweep a men's podium in a WTS race when they did so in Bermuda in April 2018. And I have a great interview, one of my favorite interviews that I've done to date with Arild coming up. And we talk about how they are very diligent in practice, exactly what we talked about today with Matt on intensity control, really sticking to making your easy training easy. That is how the Norwegians have made a super small nation a triathlon powerhouse, and that is how you can make sure that you get the most out of your training as well. As always, I take the show notes for you, and you can find them on thattriathlonshow.com. If you have comments or questions, leave them in the comments section on that show notes page. And in the next episode, there's more of Matt on That Triathlon Show. He returns to talk about one of his other books, which I think is my favorite of all the books that he's written. I haven't read quite all of the 25 or so books, but I've probably read 10 or more of Matt's books. And The Endurance Diet, which is what we'll talk about in the next episode, is my favorite. It is absolutely brilliant. It's about how Matt did extensive research, systematic and informal investigations into how elite endurance athletes across disciplines all over the world, different continents, how they eat. And he basically synthesized all of his research results and the informal investigations into 5 core habits that are the endurance diet. And it's diet with tongue-in-cheek. It's not really a diet. It's an approach to nutrition. And we'll get into that in the next episode. So this is one that you don't want to miss. Of course, to make sure that you don't miss it, please subscribe to the podcast if you aren't already, to make sure that you get all the new episodes as they are released. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, a number of Android apps. I think Pocket Cast is the best app on Android, even YouTube. And if you have been a long-time listener, please consider leaving a rating and review for the podcast if you enjoy it. That is very important. It's how the podcast can keep growing. And growing is what allows me to keep putting the time and resources required into creating it every single week, actually 2 times per week. Big thanks to somebody who did leave a rating and review. That is Bradell G from Italy, who writes, super informative for newbies like me. 5 stars. I discovered That Triathlon Show only a few weeks ago, and I'm now binging on the podcast. Makes my morning and evening commute so much more interesting and productive. Great interviews, great intel and info. I'm a fan. Thank you so much, Bradell. It really means a lot to me to read reviews like this. I really appreciate it. Finally, I also really appreciate our great sponsors, Stack, that you can find on stackzero.com. That's STAC0 spelled out, .com. And you can find their great bike trainers, the Stack Zero Base, the Stack Zero Power Meter, and the new smart trainer version, the Stack Zero Halcyon there. And you can find all of their specifications, features, and benefits, of course. And then when it is time to order, be sure to use the promo code TTS20 to get 20% off your Stack Zero bike trainer. And big thanks to Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get your personalized hydration strategy to make sure that you replenish electrolytes, including sodium, as you should in training and in racing. And if you haven't ordered from Precision Hydration before, you can get your first box for free with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.